In this video, I'm going to show you how to place the inner wheel bearing on the back of this Chevy Silverado 2500. Just so you know, when you do this job, I highly recommend that you replace your wheel seal as well. It sits on the back of the hub. We have to pop it out to get the race off. So let's get started. Let's remove the wheel. First, if your truck has these, remove your center caps with a 22mm socket. These are just plastic mounting nuts, so be careful with them. You don't want to break them. Take this off and set it aside. Now remove all 8 of your 22mm lug nuts. If your wheel is stuck like this one, put one lug nut back on for safety, and then take a rubber mallet and tap it with that rubber mallet on the tire, not on the rim, from the backside. There we go. The lug nut held that wheel on so it doesn't fall off. Now take it off and remove the wheel. With a 21mm socket, let's remove the entire caliper and bracket assembly off of the rear axle. You cannot separate these unless you have a very shallow tool that'll fit in here, and I don't. So I'm going to take the whole thing off and split it apart once it's up on the leaf spring. Once again, 21mm socket. I'm going to leave this bolt in a couple turns to hold the caliper while I take off the top bolt, which unfortunately I cannot fit a power tool in, so I'm going to have to do that one by hand. Have a long ratchet or a long breaker bar ready to break this free. Take this bolt out, support the caliper, take the lower bolt out, flip the caliper over on top of the leaf spring. Make sure you don't pull on this brake hose and put no pressure on it. It will damage it if you do that. At this point, you should be able to pull the rotor off. However, ours is seized on this hub, so I'm going to put in 2 bolts. They're 8x125 thread. Thread them in until they bottom out into these threaded holes here, and this is going to help you pull the rotor off. So as you thread these bolts in, it'll push on the hub, push the rotor off. Go back and forth. This should apply even pressure. All right, that's off. Take my bolts out. Take the rotor off. Remove all 19mm bolts off of the end of the axle here so we can separate it from the hub. Make sure you have a collection bucket underneath because it will leak fluid once the seal breaks free. Whoa. Wipe it off as you take it out so it doesn't drip all over. Before I continue removing things, I want to feel for how tight or how loose this hub is. Basically, if I spin it with medium force, it does almost 1 full rotation. If I spin it with more force, it'll do about 1 rotation. And basically, I want to take note of this so that I can make it just as tight when I reinstall, unless you have the proper tools to torque this to spec. You're going to have to basically go by feel. What you're looking for here is for it not to just free spin forever and ever, but not to be snugged up to the point where it takes a lot of force to spin it. Now there's a little retainer on this nut that's on here, so I'm going to take a pick and just pick off this retainer. Just pry it off like that. There we go. Now you have to remove the pin that's at the top. If it's stuck in there because the nut is putting pressure on it, well, just remove the nut and release pressure. Take a magnet, stick it onto it, and remove this. Do not lose it because you will need it to lock everything in when you reinstall. Now you need a special socket to remove this nut, and if you don't have it, of course you can use whatever you can get your hands on to unthread it, but I'm just going to use the socket. And it should not be very tight because, well, it's not meant to clamp down very tight. It's just meant to prevent the hub from walking off of here. Remove the nut all the way. There it is. At this point, there's nothing holding this on except for the wheel seal on the inboard side, and we just have to pop it off. I'm going to take a pry bar. Be careful with your parking brake shoes, and just pry it out of here. Before I pry it, I'm going to put this nut on just a couple threads so I can hold it on and prevent it from, well, pretty much flying off of here as soon as it pops off. Okay. There we go. Remove the nut, which held it on perfectly, so that was good. And pull off your hub. More oil will come out, so make sure you drain it appropriately. Now we need to remove the seal. You have a couple options for this. You can either put a pry bar in here and pop it out, but I find that to be more difficult. What I do like to do is just take a chisel and chisel it up and out. There it is. Now grab your inner bearing, pull it out, set it aside. Now to remove this race, we actually have to hammer it from the front side and basically just pop the race out of here. So I'm going to flip this hub over and work from the top. This is what I will be doing basically. You won't be able to see as I'm doing it because the hub has to lay flat down, but I'm going to take a punch and a hammer and just go around the whole perimeter and evenly punch this race out. That's it. It's pretty much bottomed out. At this point I can't lay the hub flat anymore, so I'm going to bring it up like this, punch it out from the back side or from the front. All right, there's the surface, there's your race. Now we can install a new one. Now with this surface cleaned up in here, inspect it, make sure it's actually in good condition, which it is. So I'm going to reinstall a new race. And the way to do this is basically the same way that we took it out. Just tap it back and forth until it seats. Start out slow. And then continue driving it down. All right, that is fully seated, and the reason I know that is because when I punch it, not just the punch, but also my hammer bounces right back. It doesn't actually drive the bearing down. You can also look at it, feel it, make sure you can't feel a lip in there. Look at it from the front side, and I can see that it is 100% fully seated in there. So we're good to go. We can put the inner bearing in. At this point, we have to add oil to our bearings. It's very important to pre-lubricate them so that when the truck starts rolling, even though I will show you how to properly tip the differential to actually get more oil in here, but it's important for them not to be completely dry when you start. So take your gear oil that you're going to be using to top off the differential, and I'm just going to put some on the race here, let it run down onto the outer bearing, and then give that bearing a little spin so that you can work it into all of the rollers. This can make a mess, so make sure you have something to absorb the oil on the bottom. Now let's put on the inner bearing onto its race. Add oil. Roll it around. Okay, and now we are ready to install our new seal. This is where the seal is going to sit, and you want to inspect this surface. A lot of times, if the seal goes bad, you'll have corrosion in here, or even if the seal is still good. But even if the seal is still good, sometimes water sneaks in here, creates a lot of rust. Mine is perfect, so I'm not worried about that. I'm going to wipe it clean and grab the new seal, and let's drive it down. If you have a large block of wood, that would be ideal. If not, just find something that will hammer this down evenly. If you really don't have anything, take a rubber mallet and gently tap on the outside, going around and around to seat this evenly. Try not to tap on the rubber part of the seal, just tap on the outer piece here because it's more reinforced, and obviously the rubber will just disintegrate or break if you hit that with a hammer. Having said that, I'm going to try my best to tap it as even as possible. This rubber here is what's going to create a perfect seal, so if you go at an angle, it could get damaged, so be careful. Fix it as soon as you see that. Just tap it on the other side and drive this down until it's completely seated up against the hub. I'm going to use a rubber dead blow hammer and just tap it down. That's bottomed out. You can check all around the edge and make sure. There you have it, seal is installed. I want to clean up the spindle part of the rear axle here on the back side where the seal sits, and I'm going to use some 320 grit sandpaper and just lightly scuff this up because I want the new seal to sit properly. If your truck doesn't have a lot of rust issues like this one, you probably don't need to do this, but I do. It's pretty corroded here, and I want to make sure that no water gets in here, and of course no oil leaks out. If any oil leaks out, it's going to get all over your e-brake shoes, and that's going to cause a lot of different problems, and you don't want to have to deal with it again. So make sure it's going to seat properly. Now, of course, don't use anything like a very abrasive sanding disc on a power tool. Otherwise, it'll damage the axle, and that's going to cause even more problems. Just lightly scuff it up with some fine grit sandpaper. After I use this 320 grit, I'm actually going to go up to a 400 and a 600 grit to smooth things out. I don't want any rough grooves in here. I just want it nice and smooth, and then we can get ready to reinstall the hub. Now that everything is cleaned up, it's nice and smooth, and yeah, sure, you can still see rust here, but it's basically past where the seal sits, and it's also nice and smooth. I'm going to rinse it off with brake parts cleaner. I have this rag in here to prevent any debris from getting in there, especially brake parts cleaner. Rinse off the entire area, and wherever you got any of the sanding dust. Now let's oil up the surface, mostly so that it can be pre-lubricated, but also so that everything can slide on nicely. Just coat it with a thin layer. Obviously, gear oil will coat all of this as you start driving anyway. Once this is all oiled up and ready to go, let's install the hub. Take your hub, gently slide it over so you don't damage the seal on the back. Make sure it all lines up. And now, it's going to take just a little bit of pushing, there we go, to get that on. That's fully seated all the way. It spins smoothly, obviously. If it didn't, that would be a big problem. It's not even tightened down yet. But at this point, if you need to tap it with a rubber mallet once or twice, go ahead, but you shouldn't need to. If your surface on the seal side is clean, it should slide right on, especially since it's oiled up. So now let's put the nut on that holds everything from the outside. These threads are clean and oiled, so this should slide on nice and smooth all the way in. We're going to snug it up so that it puts some pressure on those bearings and seats them. This you can pretty much go all the way by hand. At this point, you'll need some sort of tool to snug it up, whether you use your special socket or whatever else you're doing. Okay, tighten it up. Give this a couple spins. I'm actually going to put a ratchet on the end of this so that I can put a little bit of pressure on it. We're not going to leave it like that, but you do want to snug them and seat the bearings tight. Set your tool in, give this a quick snug. As you snug it, the hub should have more resistance on it. That's normal, that's what you want. I tightened it down. This has quite a bit of resistance. Obviously, we're not leaving it like this. I'm going to back this nut off to the closest slot where I can line up that locking pin. That should be right about there. However, this feels a lot tighter than it did when I initially tested the bearing or the hub. So I'm actually going to back it off one more. That feels a lot better. It does about one full rotation. I'm actually going to mark it here so that we can visually see this better. Yeah, that's about one full rotation every time. So now let's line that slot up. And like that. Perfect. We can put that pin in to lock it down tight. Slide it through all the way in. And then in this particular application, we had this cover. Just press that on. This should not require a lot of force to put on. If it does, it's probably not lined up. Just seated right up against that nut. That's it right there. That's installed. Now let's clean up the mating surface on the axle side. There is a gasket here, as you can see. If you have another gasket, you could clean this one off and put another one on. I don't. I'm going to use RTV, which is totally fine. It'll seal up, but of course we have to clean up this surface. You can see there's an area here where it's raised up. I'm going to use my pick and kind of slice through it so I can have an area to start and get this old gasket off of here. And you can basically just use a razor blade the rest of the way and scrape it. Hopefully your axle is not rusty. If this gasket was failed, water would have gotten in and rusted out this entire surface, in which case you'd want to sand it down a little, make sure it's nice and clean like this. But for me, I'm just going to scrape the gasket off and continue on afterwards. All right, the surface is gasket free now. It is very clean, so I'm not worried about it. All I'm going to do here at this point is degrease it with brake parts cleaner, and we can apply some RTV and seal it all up. Let's degrease this surface with some brake parts cleaner on a clean rag. Because we are using gasket maker, RTV, we have to make sure there is no oil left on here. And because we're doing this cleaning step now, I'm actually going to take a blowgun and blow compressed air into all of these holes. These are dead-end holes, and if there's oil in here and you thread the bolt in, it can cause some damage because it'll basically hydrolock that hole. And if you do have oil in any of them, it is a good idea to flush them out with brake parts cleaner and then blow compressed air into them. As you could see, that one had some debris in there, some moisture. All right, we're good to go. This surface is dry. Apply a very thin layer of RTV. If you put too much, it can actually squish to the inside of the hub here, and that would not be good. Once you've gone around and put one full bead of RTV all around, let's get the axle on. Carefully slide your axle shaft back in. Try not to drag it along the entire differential. As you get to the end here, you're going to want to guide it so that it can actually line up with the splines there. It's could be a little tricky, so you can get it through. Give it a couple spins if you need to. Oh, there we go. And right over here. Before I get very close, I'm going to try to line up the bolt holes so I can get the bolts through without smudging the RTV around. I've cleaned up the threads on all of my bolts, got rid of the old thread locker, and I applied some new thread locker. Lift the axle up, start in one bolt. This is going to guide the axle in place and line it up. However, I don't want to let go yet. I'm going to start in a second bolt. Once you get two started and close to being bottomed out, all the rest of them should be lined up. So then you can let go. I'm going to skip one for now just so I can make sure it's seated properly. All right, now I'll start in the rest of them. Now let's tighten them all up. I'm going to go in a cross pattern and just snug them, and then I will come back and torque them properly. Doesn't matter on which one you start, but it does matter that you go in a cross pattern so everything can get seated properly. I'm going to wait a couple minutes for the RTV to cure just a little bit, and then I will squish it down with its final torque. I have a long pry bar going through the lug studs, and that's going to hold the hub for me from spinning. If you wanted to, you could actually finish the job, put the rotor on and everything, and then put the wheel on without the center cap, and that'll give you access to these bolts, and then you could just torque it when it's on the ground. But I have a pry bar here, and I'm just going to do it this way. 167 foot-pounds is the torque for all of these. I'm going to go in a cross pattern, and as I torque one, I will mark it. That way I don't accidentally go over it again instead of the one that I have not torqued yet. That's all of them. I'm going to actually go around in a circle one more time just to make sure that the first ones didn't loosen up on me. But after I do that, this should be all torqued. Now let's clean the hub surface where the rotor sits so that when I put the rotor on, it is nice and flat. I don't want any rust buildup here. Mine doesn't look too bad. The rotor was a little bit stuck on here, so I'm going to focus on this ridge here where the rotor actually sits on the center of the hub. But the rest of it is actually in good condition, so I'm not too worried once again. If you need to sand it down, be very careful not to remove too much material. I'm just going to go in with a wire brush and clean it up. Rinse this off with brake parts cleaner. Now it's a good idea to coat this with an anti-corrosive coating. I like to use anti-seize for this. Try not to get it on the lug studs. I'm using a new rotor, but if you're reusing your old rotor, make sure you clean the hat of the rotor on the inside where it sits on the hub, just like we did the hub. Now put your rotor on. Now grab your caliper, slide it over the rotor. Okay. Start in the bottom. Snug these bolts up. The top will have to be done by hand because there's no space for an air tool. 221 is the torque for both of these bolts. There's one. and 2. Let's get the wheel on. Put on all 8 of your lug nuts, bottom them out in a cross pattern, and then also in a cross pattern, we're going to torque them to 140 foot-pounds. Once again, 140 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Put your center cap on if your truck has this, and with the same socket you used for the lug nuts, tighten these up just by hand, make them snug. These are plastic. If you strip them out once, they probably won't hold anymore, so just go in a cross pattern, that way this seats evenly. Tighten these up. They kind of click in place once they're locked in, so that's how you know. On the passenger side of your rear differential towards the front where the pinion is, you're going to find your 3/8 drive fill plug, remove it, stick an extension with a ratchet in here, break it free, remove it the rest of the way. Since we drained some, when you pull this plug off, nothing should come out. This differential takes 75 W90 gear oil, and if yours is a limited slip differential, make sure you add the fluid with the correct additive in it or add the additive separately. To fill it, add gear oil until it comes out the fill plug. Of course, make sure you're on level ground so that it can read properly, or, well, fill accurately, I should say. As you can see, I put in about 1/4 quart and it's already running out. So I'm going to call this done. Cap it off. Wipe off any drippage. Stick your extension back in here and snug it up. Once it bottoms out, just give it a little extra. Now with the differential full, let's tip the differential. This is important so that the bearings can pretty much flood in oil and be lubricated properly. I know we already put oil in there, but this is something that I strongly recommend that you do. On the opposite side that you worked on, you want to put a floor jack underneath and raise up the differential so it's basically angled and the fluid will run down with gravity pulling it that way towards the side that we worked on. And I like to leave it like that for about 10-15 minutes. You don't need a severe angle on that differential, just a little bit, obviously. Naturally, the oil will run down there. And after you're done, before you put this back down, give the wheel a few spins so those bearings can roll around in oil, and then you're good to go. It's been about 10-15 minutes at this point. I'm going to spin this around like that. And now, this should be good to go. I'm going to lower this back down. And that's it. The job is done.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.